Hey guys, we're now officially in the final stretch before the midterm elections on the 8th of November. We have just 2 weeks to go, and this race for the Senate majority is more contentious than it's ever been. Both parties have practically the same chance at winning statistically. 45-55 means absolutely nothing. Both parties are in the running for control of the upper chamber of Congress, while Democrats do still have a very slight edge, but the Senate races are going to go down to the wire in many key states. And today we'll be taking a look at the Senate elections based on the latest polling that we have. We have polls from 31 out of the 35 races this year. We don't have polls from Idaho, North Dakota, Alabama, or Hawaii, but in all 31 of the remaining elections, we do have polling data that we will be going over in this video. Starting off with Washington, where Patty Murray, who was first elected in 1992, is running for her 5th term in office. She leads by 8.6% in the polls against Tiffany Smiley, her Republican challenger. Smiley came in 2nd place in the blanket primary a couple of months ago, which means that she will go up against the Democratic incumbent, who was elected to a 4th term back in 2016 by 18%. Her margin is going to be considerably smaller this time around, but she is still definitely on track to winning for a 5th time. I think she's going to win in the end by around 7 to 9 points, and so Washington is going to be the first state we fill in, and it will be likely for the Democrats. While in Oregon and California, these races are going to be solid blue, as Ron Wyden and Alex Padilla are on track to winning their re-elections. Wyden is leading in every single poll against Joey Perkins, while Alex Padilla is performing very well against Mark Muser in his first election to win his first full term as a U.S. Senator. Next up, in Nevada, we have one of the closest races of the year. This is between Catherine Cortez Masto and Adam Laxalt. Laxalt is actually ahead in the polls by 0.3% against the Democratic incumbent. Masto is probably the most vulnerable incumbent Democrat running for re-election this year, and she has been behind in all 4 of the most recent polls conducted for this election. When looking at the 530 forecast, Adam Laxalt is actually the favored candidate now. He has a 54% chance at defeating Catherine Cortez Masto. And a loss for Nevada is not going to be good for Democrats, but it will not be detrimental to their chances at maintaining a majority. If John Fetterman wins in Pennsylvania and Warnock in Georgia, as long as Democrats also maintain their seat in Arizona, a loss in Nevada will be okay, and they will still be able to get to the 50 seats that they need. But if Democrats cannot flip Pennsylvania, they probably are not going to win the Senate if they do in fact lose in the Silver State. But Adam Laxalt is in the best position he's been in over the last couple of months. He fell behind in the early months of the summer, and he's been behind for quite a while, but in just the last couple of weeks, he's taken a pretty clear lead, as most of the most recent polls do now have Adam Laxalt, the failed 2018 gubernatorial candidate, defeating Catherine Cortez Masto this November, and so Nevada is going to be a tilt Republican state according to the latest data. And we have another competitive election in Utah between Evan McMullin and incumbent Mike Lee. Lee was elected by 41 points in 2016, but now he is in a much closer race against McMullin, who is a conservative independent. In fact, Mike Lee only leads by 7.8% in the polls. That is a very small margin for a Republican in a state as red as Utah, but Republicans just aren't too popular in the state anymore, especially Republicans that are too far to the right and in the Trump wing of the party. McMullin is much more moderate, so he is able to garner both Democratic voters as well as most voters in the center who are not so favorably viewing Donald Trump. And so when looking at the 530 forecast, the race is barely a solid state, as Mike Lee has a 95% chance at winning, and going from 95 to over 99, that's a pretty significant difference. And so Utah is going to be one of the most interesting elections that we have this year. I don't think Mike Lee is going to win by a solid margin, but I do think in the end he will still come out on top and win a 2nd term in office. In Arizona, we have a seat the Democrats must win if they want to maintain their 50-seat majority. Democrats are not going to retain control of the Senate if Mark Kelly loses his re-election. Mark Kelly winning is vital to the Democrats' chances at winning the Senate for a 2nd time in a row. And so Kelly is currently up by 4.6% in the polls. This race has definitely tightened over the last couple of weeks, but Mark Kelly is still in a relatively strong position, especially when compared to Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada or Ralph Kelly Warnock in Georgia, and even though he won by 2 points in 2020, 2022 is going to be a different year. I think the thing that's keeping Mark Kelly afloat is that Blake Masters simply is not a good nominee for this race. If Republicans had chosen anyone else like Mark Bronovich or Jim Lehman, Kelly would probably be in a much tougher position, but right now he is still on track to winning re-election. 530 gives him a 74% chance at winning, so it's just barely a lean Democratic state, very close to becoming likely once again, but Mark Kelly up by 4 points in the polls will make Arizona a lean state based on the latest numbers. And then in Colorado, Michael Bennet is on track to winning for a third time after first being appointed to the Senate in 2009. Michael Bennet subsequently won re-election in both 2010 and 2016, and this year he's up in the polls by 8.8%. This is actually better than his showing from 6 years ago, because last time he only won by a 6-point margin. And so I think Michael Bennet will do better than he did in 2016 and win by a similar margin to Patty Murray in Washington, which will make the state of Colorado likely Democratic. And then we have 3 races that are going to be solid for the GOP: South Dakota, Kansas, and Oklahoma. All 3 of these states have Republican incumbents running for re-election. In South Dakota, John Thune is up against Brian Bangs. In the state of Kansas, we're seeing Jerry Moran defeat Mark Holland. And then finally in Oklahoma, in the regular election, James Langford is going to defeat Madison Horn. He's up currently by 16 points in the polling average. However, we do have another election in the state because Jim Inhofe is going to retire early next year, which means that he will not serve until 2027, despite just being reelected last year. And so the seat will be open, which means that Markwayne Mullin will be the one to take it as the Republican nominee. Now, he is performing worse than James Langford, and he is not up by a solid margin. Obviously, the average is around 12 to 13 points, so the special election in Oklahoma is going to be only likely for the GOP. But we do have a solid race for Republicans in Alaska, where Lisa Murkowski is running for re-election against Kelly Tshibaka. The fact that both of the top 2 candidates are Republicans means that this race will be solid for the GOP. No matter what, a Republican is going to win, and of course, Kelly Tshibaka is only having support because Murkowski voted to impeach Donald Trump, so we have the more moderate wing of the GOP running against the Trump wing of the Republican Party, and we're just going to wait and see who actually comes out on top in the final round of ranked choice voting, which will, for the first time ever, be used for a Senate race this year. And now we're going to move on to the 4 races that are still west of the Mississippi, starting off with Iowa and then moving down to Louisiana. So in Iowa, Chuck Grassley, the 7-time incumbent, is now running for an 8th term, and he's only ahead by 6.9% against Michael Franken. This is a historical low for Grassley, who has been able to win by solid margins in every election since his first one in 1980. That was the only race that was competitive over the last 4 years in the state. Ever since he was reelected in 1986, he's won by margins over 15% every time, sometimes even 30% and even 40% margins in the early 2000s. But this year, the election between Chuck Grassley and Michael Franken is going to be one to watch, as Chuck Grassley is not going to win by a solid margin. Even his own campaign polls don't have him up by 15%, and so Michael Franken, as a former Navy Vice Admiral, is really performing well and making Iowa not so solid for the GOP as much as it was for Chuck Grassley over almost half a century. Meanwhile, in Missouri, Eric Schmidt is doing slightly better than Chuck Grassley in Iowa, but this race isn't too exciting. Schmidt is up by 12 points in the polls against Trudy Butch Valentine, and Eric Schmidt is on track to winning his first full term, succeeding Roy Blunt, who is going to retire after barely winning re-election in 2016 against Jason Kander by just 2.8%. So Roy Blunt, who is a very unpopular senator, is going to leave the upper chamber, and that, of course, will make room for Eric Schmidt to become the newest member, with Trudy Butch Valentine as the Democratic nominee who is going to lose this race. And so Missouri is also going to be likely Republican, with, of course, Schmidt up by a double-digit margin. However, in the states of Arkansas and Louisiana, Republicans are going to do considerably better, especially in Louisiana, where John Kennedy is leading by 30 points in every single poll. And that's because we do not have primaries in this state. Every candidate runs in the election in November, and for Kennedy to win outright, he's going to have to win a majority of the vote, or he will face a runoff election. But now that Kennedy is the incumbent and running for a second term, he will most likely hit the 50% threshold, while in Arkansas, John Boozman is going to easily win re-election as well. And so both of these states are going to be solid red as Republicans dominate the Deep South. Now we're going to come back up to Wisconsin and then the rest of the Rust Belt. So in the race between Ron Johnson and Mandela Barnes, Johnson has taken a very strong lead against the Democratic Lieutenant Governor. Ron Johnson here is ahead by 2.9% in the polling average, and this race is not going to be close at all, as Ron Johnson won by 3 points in 2016, despite almost every single poll showing that Russ Feingold, the Democratic candidate, was going to win. And he did the same thing in 2010. Ron Johnson has continued to outperform expectations, and even this year it looked like he was going to lose for quite a while, but now he's taken a pretty strong lead, and with Johnson ahead by 3 points, I think it's inevitable that he's going to win his third term in office. Mandela Barnes is really not running that impactful of a campaign, and 538 right now gives Johnson a 76% chance at winning, making the state likely Republican, but according to the polls, it's only going to be lean. And then Illinois is, of course, going to be solid. Tammy Duckworth up by 17 points against Kathy Salvi. This election isn't going to be close. Kathy Salvi stands no chance against the popular Duckworth. However, in Indiana, we do have a surprisingly close race. Todd Young only leads by 2 and 3%, according to the two latest polls against Thomas McDermott Jr. Thomas McDermott is a strong Democratic nominee, and Todd Young barely won in 2016, only winning the state by 9.7% against Evan Bayh. Now, the election in 2016 was against a former two-term senator, so that did definitely make the race closer, but this year, it looks like Todd Young might not even win by a solid margin, despite 2022 being a much better year for Democrats, and honestly, Indiana should be a state that Young can win by over 15 points in, but as of right now, it's only going to be lean Republican, according to the polls. I think in the end, he's at least going to win by 10 points, and the polls are going to be wrong, but 15%, that may be difficult. And then in Kentucky, we have Rand Paul against Charles Booker, and Paul is up by 16 points, so that state is, of course, going to be solid red. However, in Ohio, this race isn't even near being solid for the Republican Party, even though it honestly should be, with Mike DeWine winning by 15 to 20 points based on every projection in the governor election against Nan Whaley in the Buckeye State. But when looking at the Senate race, J.D. Vance barely leads over Democrat Tim Ryan. Vance was, of course, the Trump-endorsed Republican nominee. He ended up winning the primary with just a third of the vote, and he's probably going to do worse than even Donald Trump did in the 2020 presidential election in the state. J.D. Vance might not even win by over 5%. At this point, I think he's going to be lucky to even win by 3 to 4%, as Tim Ryan has really made this race very, very competitive over the last couple of months. But in the end, the year is 2022. Tim Ryan is probably not going to win. If the environment was more like that of 2018, I do think that Tim Ryan would be able to defeat J.D. Vance, despite Ohio being a red state. But this year, according to the latest polls, J.D. Vance is barely going to scrape by with a lean margin of victory. And then in Pennsylvania, this is the race that everyone is talking about. This is the election that's going to give either one party that majority, whether it's John Fetterman in the Democrats or Mehmet Oz in the Republicans. Pennsylvania is going to be the tipping point state. And so looking at this race, John Fetterman's lead in the polls has shrunk to just 2.2%. At the very beginning of October, he was still ahead by 6 points, and his lead has really shrunk dramatically in just the last couple of days, with there now being the first ever poll to show Mehmet Oz leading against the Democratic Lieutenant Governor. Obviously, this poll is going to be wrong. Pennsylvania is going to be much closer when looking at the final results. I think that John Fetterman still does have a slight advantage, but definitely Pennsylvania is much more of a toss-up than it was just 2 weeks ago. 538 has also moved the state into the toss-up column, with John Fetterman having a 59% chance at winning and 41 for Mehmet Oz. So based on the latest numbers, Pennsylvania is still going to be a lean Democratic state, but this state is definitely going to be one to watch, as if John Fetterman loses, Democrats will have a much tougher time winning 50 seats. And then in the North Atlantic, we have a couple of pretty solid races for Democrats. In Maryland, Chris Van Hollen is going to win his re-election against Chris Chaffee. He's up by 23 points in the latest poll. This election is not going to be close in the solid blue state of Maryland. And then in New York, Chuck Schumer leads by 17% against Joe Pinion. The governor election is much closer now, with Kathy Hochul only leading by 6% against Lee Zeldin. But in the Senate election, Chuck Schumer, as the Senate Majority Leader, is going to win his fifth 8th term in office. And then in Vermont, Patrick Leahy is the only retiring Democratic incumbent this year. However, he will be succeeded by another Democrat, that being Peter Welch. Of course, Democrats are going to win the Senate seat in Vermont. However, Peter Welch will actually only be the second Democratic senator to ever represent the state after he is elected, as we have had independents, but every single other senator from the state of Vermont besides Patrick Leahy has been a Republican, despite Vermont being one of the original 13 states. And so all three of these races that we just went over, Maryland, New York, and Vermont, are going to be solid blue. While in New Hampshire and Connecticut, these races are only going to get the likely Democratic rating. Maggie Hassan is going to win re-election in the Granite State. She's up by 7.4% against Don Bolduc. Bolduc isn't really making this race too competitive at all. Even his own campaign poll has Hassan up by 2. I think in the end, Maggie Hassan is going to win by just over 5 points, making it likely, but it will definitely be a much stronger victory than her 2016 race, which was a flip, but she still only won by 0.1%. And so New Hampshire right now is likely Democratic, with Maggie Hassan having an 81% chance of winning. While in Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal does have a 98% chance at victory, but the polls do only show him up by 11.7%. He was almost at 15 points for a month there, but now his numbers have gone down. Leora Levy was actually within 5 points of Blumenthal in the latest poll. Richard Blumenthal was first elected in 2016, is going to win his re-election. There's no doubt about that. Both Connecticut and New Hampshire are going to remain blue states, however, only by likely margins. And so now we have 4 elections left, and starting off with North Carolina, we're going to go down to Florida. So in North Carolina, the Tar Heel state, Ted Budd is on track to winning and succeeding Richard Burr. Sherry Beasley is down by 3 points in the polls, and honestly, she was never going to win this election, even when she was ahead by 1 point in September. Democrats are not going to flip North Carolina this year. The last time that they won a Senate race in the state was back in 2008 when Kay Hagan was elected, but she would lose her re-election in 2014. And Democrats, even though they've poured hundreds of millions of dollars over the last decade into trying to flip this seat back, this is just not going to happen. Ted Budd is going to win this year, and Sherry Beasley is not going to be the Democratic savior. Democrats are going to lose in North Carolina like they did in 2020 with Cal Cunningham's loss to Tom Tillis, while in South Carolina, the race is going to be even more solid for the GOP, where Tim Scott is up by a solid margin against Kearsarge Matthews. Even though Lindsey Graham only won by 10 points in 2020 against Jamie Harrison, Tim Scott is a much more popular senator and will win by at least 15 to 20%. In Georgia, I do think there will be runoffs, so we're actually going to go over Florida first, because I think Georgia will be the last state that will be decided this cycle. And so in the Sunshine State, Marco Rubio is on track to winning for a 3rd time against Val Demings. He's up by 4.4% in the polls. I think he will get to at least 5 in the very end, but he will still do worse than Ron DeSantis in the governor election against Charlie Crist. And so according to the data, Florida is going to be lean Republican. While in Georgia, the reason why I'm going over this race last is because I don't think either Ralphie Warnock or Herschel Walker are going to get to 50%. They've consistently both polled under that threshold, and we do have a Libertarian candidate in the race. And of course, in both Senate elections in 2020, nobody got to 50%. That's why these races were decided in a runoff in early January. But this year, since it's not a presidential election year, the runoff will be held in December, which means that Georgia is going to be the last state that will decide its winner. And if Democrats can get to 49 seats and Republicans at 50 before Georgia chooses its actual winner, I think Democrats will end up winning. I think that Ralph Warnock is going to win the plurality in the first round, but that will not be enough for him to win his first full term outright, which means that in the runoff, I think that if this is what the map looks like without Georgia, Democrats are going to win because they will have the enthusiasm behind them. But if Republicans can somehow win in a state like Pennsylvania and they're already at the majority, no, I don't think Ralph Warnock is going to win his re-election, as Democrats simply won't be as motivated to come out and vote. But right now, based on what we're seeing, I do have Georgia as going to Warnock, but it's still going to be a very, very close race. If Republicans had chosen any more of a generic Republican nominee besides Herschel Walker, they would definitely be winning in this election. Warnock was very, very vulnerable, but Democrats really have been gifted the nominee Herschel Walker by the GOP, and so according to the latest polls, the race is going to be lean Democratic, and of course Georgia is known for having some of the most accurate polls in the entire country. With that said, this is the 2022 Senate map based on the latest polls. Democrats are winning in 3 out of the 4 most important races of the year. Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania currently do still favor Democrats based on the data, while Republicans have taken the lead in the Silver State. I think the map is going to look something like this in the very end, but Pennsylvania and Georgia could honestly go both ways. So the Senate elections are closer than they've ever been, and we're only 2 weeks away from the midterms. This is definitely going to be an exciting election night to watch. And so that will be it for this video, but just once again, according to the latest polls right now, 2 weeks out, 50-50 is what the polls are projecting. And so that will be it for this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win the majority, and do you agree with what polling data is telling us right now? Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I will see you guys in the next video.